saying record. I guess it was like record on cloud or record on computer. I want to record on the computer.
Just record. There we go. Boom. Down there.
It wants me to record on my microwave or something, you know. So,
You're
anyway,
popping popcorn and it starts speaking about Nietzsche.
Okay, so we're here. I'm here with Daniel, and we're going to discuss Zarathustra. So Zarathustra is on both of our minds recently. You wrote a paper and did a kind of lecture with Cadell. I'll put the link in the description to that so people can look at it. And I've recently been doing some videos. I'm writing about Zarathustra. Now, word of warning, I'm nearly finished part 3 of Zarathustra, so I've not read part 4. So I'm not even I'm not even complete. So yeah. But anyway, I got so much out of those 3 sections that it's worth just going ahead. So we'll start maybe by I'll just ask you kind of what your main takeaways from Zarathustra have been. I know you did this lecture and you talked a lot about bestowcentrism. So could you explain what that is and how that relates to Zarathustra?
Well, that's a great question. And first off, Owen, it's a thrill to speak with you. I have to let you know, Michelle and I are going to be doing this course at Parallax on Ivan Illich, and we will definitely be incorporating your work on Thymos, Notes from a Pod. There's a whole section on where you talk about how it used to be brave to go out without armor, and now it's like, and how that's kind of a heroic thing, a thymotic thing. And I think that has something to say about the tools of conveniality that Ivan Illich talks about. So I'm in your debt. So thank you for that. Thank you also for watching the presentation. Also, the videos you have on Zarathustra, where you're really paying attention to the architecture, is extraordinary. That's very well done. I had not paid attention to that, and I found it very engaging. And I think that basically just speaks to no one does anyone finish Zarathustra, really? I mean, you read it and you're like, oh, didn't notice that about the architecture. Oh, didn't really notice that section about the honey being like tar. Oh, didn't know that. And that's, I think, speaking to the genius of it. And I do sometimes think a book like this requires that strange blend of literature and philosophy that is hard to arrive at. Literary skill and philosophical skill that might be difficult to arrive at in our overly specialized academic world. So it's a great privilege to have a chance to speak to you. And yes, we did the abyssal arrows, and we had that, and there's a section in there on bestocentrism. It was part of a conference. I just wanted an excuse to show the cover of the book. I couldn't help myself. So, you know, so it was part of a conference that followed from a class Cadell taught at Philosophy Portal on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which was wonderful. A lot of it also was interesting because we were trying to think Nietzsche and Hegel together. We had done the phenomenology of spirit, then thinking how may Nietzsche's becoming be thought alongside with Hegel's, and it'd be something that's going to more really be honoring Nietzsche beyond just knowing that he said something about the death of God, which, you know, that's what most people know, but that's such a well, a way to think about this is to get to the bestocentrism topic. A lot of people may not realize that Thus Spoke Zarathustra is like the final section of Book 4 of the Gay Science. And near the end of Book 4 of the Gay Science, you also have the death of God thing, and you have the eternal return. And it's almost as if Nietzsche was so overwhelmed by, I would say, those 3 ideas together, that then he has to go and write Thus Spoke Zarathustra. What's then very important, though, is that he comes back later. I think he does Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil. And then he comes back later and does Book 5. And arguably Book 5 of the Gay Science and the Genealogy of Morals are probably the last, I want to say, clear philosophical text before he starts to descend into the madness of 1890 to the 1900, where he starts getting the Antichrist, and it's a much more he never really finished this project. But you get a real, I think, clear kind of understanding of where Nietzsche's thinking is going in Book 5 of the Gay Science, which actually, I think, basically all of Thus Spoke Zarathustra is playing out in different ways. And the way I describe Book 5 of the Gay Science is that Nietzsche is resisting bestocentrism. By that, which is the idea that you get your identity from something else, from something external. You get your understanding of the world from something external. And he really wants to be focused on becoming. Now, no one is saying that bestow has no role whatsoever. You're going to get something from the outside world. You're going to get ideas from others. It's centricism. The key is the centricism, as in your entire life is organized around external validation and external source. And what's so important is, though everyone knows that it's like, oh, we can't rely on a transcendental guarantee for our beliefs. God is dead. Well, in book 5 of the Gay Science, he's telling you can't rely on nationalism, science, experts, occupation. He critiques pragmatism. You can't say, oh, it's practical and therefore you're absolved of the responsibility to think because you say it's practical. He goes after so many different sources of external becoming that is thus bestowing. And he's critiquing all of those. It's not just religion. It is a much broader picture. In fact, I find some of his critiques of pragmatism particularly fascinating, because he's like, we live in a world now that doesn't think, they just do what's practical. Well, then there's no becoming there, because it's the external world that defines the practical and you just do that, right? He would be, what Nietzsche would probably defend, it would be another topic, is there's a thinker named Maurice Blondel who talked about action. And he was very concerned that people were conflating pragmatism with action. He's like, this will probably get us all controlled, because who defines what constitutes pragmatism? So what's interesting, one of the key parts of the paper, and then I'll give it back to you, is that in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, like the first book has a bit of a kind of traditional structure of the teachers coming down from the mountain. We start with a kind of Plato's image coming out of the cave, capturing the sun, and he's bringing the sun to the people. But toward the end of book 1, there's almost a realization in Zarathustra that, oh, wait a minute, I'm actually avoiding the teacher role in being a teacher. I'm no longer, I'm engaging in my own beastocentrism because my identity is contingent upon being a teacher. And how there's like, oh my gosh, this is also a deconstruction of the traditional philosopher role. Because usually the philosopher has the ideas, they teach everyone. But what's so interesting is that Zarathustra is not a story of, say, enlightenment, because Zarathustra's already enlightened, right? At the start of the book, he's had all these years. It's actually a story of how being enlightened can end up a way to avoid becoming, because you actually then continually participate in beastocentrism by becoming a bestower. And Zarathustra comes to realize this, and he resists that temptation, deconstructs his own role as a philosopher in order to be a man, you could say, to be a human being, to start engaging in a continual becoming. And I would say that I've just found that thinking about Nietzsche's project as having a lot to do with deconstructing beastocentrism, which is a natural tendency and very hard to avoid, and we always have to be on guard of, in order for us to maintain and preserve a perpetual becoming, is a lot of what his work is. And that's really, really hard. And it's really natural just simply by the fact that we experience an external world. Like, you're phenomenologically set up to be victim to beastocentrism, because there's always something external to you that can kind of give you direction and ideas. And we have to fight that with everything we've got. And it's almost like, too, Nietzsche in Zarathustra realizes that he himself is at risk of falling into the mistakes of Zarathustra. And there's something very biographical in this realization that his own role as a philosopher can become something that avoids becoming. And so there's a way in which Zarathustra is written to us, and it's written to Nietzsche's self, and it's trying to make us aware of all of these different dangers there are that I think book 5 helps trace out of the Gay Science.
Okay, great. So the beastocentrism, if I have it correctly, it's really, we could like roughly map it onto the kind of common morality that is imposed externally by convention and society and so on.
Absolutely.
That might be a bit reductive, but it's within that category, right? It's within that category of problems, basically, of dangers. And so you oppose, in your lecture, this to the intrinsic, internal voice.
Yes.
So we got the beastocentrism, and we have the I can't remember the exact term you used, but the opposite, which is the internal voice. So you get the kind of external and internal. Okay, so I think that's a good way to like, I think this is a good way to kind of ground Zarathustra as like a kind of a character, because his movement from towns to isolation in a mountain, overseas, with sailing overseas, moving away from the people, going back to the people. He's saying, I have to go to my people. My cup is overflowing. One section later, he's like, screw you people. I'm sick of you. I'm out of here. it strikes me like he is the philosopher in the cave, and he's stuck in that moment of turn your heads, guys, turn your heads, and they won't do it. And he's going back and forth, and he's really frustrated with this. I kind of see Zarathustra as that figure, almost like an entire book about that one moment, nearly. So it brings up the question, and I know you touched on this in your lecture as well, of so when we're getting out of the cave, do we need an external something to impose on us externally to get us out of the cave, right?
Excellent. So another way I'll word it, because you're exactly right on the intrinsic, is the difference between extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. And basically, most of us live our lives extrinsically motivated. We're motivated by something beyond that isn't ours or that is outside of us. Could be money, could be fame, could be a title, could be acceptance. These are all things that require an external source. And so you're motivated by a goal that is external from you. And that would overlay with the bestocentrism because it's something external bestowing the motivation upon you. And so Nietzsche, and the reason why we'll talk about bestocentrism is because so many people think Nietzsche is just kind of scattered aphorisms, like, the numbered sections. What I try to say in the lecture is just take out the numbers, dang it, in the gay science between each of the sections, because they create the impression that the sections are not related to one another, that they have nothing to do with one another, when really they have there's a theme that unifies them all, and that theme is what I'll call bestocentrism and critiques of bestocentrism, which would then be a movement from an extrinsic or external motivation to an intrinsic motivation. What Zarathustra shows you is how insanely difficult it is to, one, gain intrinsic motivation, but then even more difficult to keep it when you go back and you're among the society.
Yeah.
This is why it's so hard, because if I were to map it onto a kind of Humean journey, which I think is important and Mr. Barnes is so good on, and everyone should watch Schizo FM because it's like the best radio show ever, is that what you have in Hume is everyone basically starts externally motivated. You can't help it. It's just like you're trying to make mom and dad happy. It's in the air. It's not that one day they forced you to, maybe they did, but it's just in the air. Then you go off and maybe you start individualizing and becoming yourself, and you start living according to your own values. Well, you could be intrinsically motivated in isolation. I don't want to say with relative ease, but it's much easier to do that when there's no one around you questioning you or judging you. You're just by yourself, right? Well, philosophy gives us lots of stories of going off, separating from society, and being the wise, intrinsically motivated individual. That's not the challenge. The challenge is to go back into society and maintain intrinsic motivation. And the going back and forth from the cave and the society is Zarathustra himself showing that he does not have an easy answer to this, that it is actually seemingly something you can only learn to do in the going back and forth and the imperfection and trying to get better and finding out there are things that are tempting you to external motivation that you didn't know. Oh my gosh, I thought it was safe, back to the cave. Okay, I need to go back, and you're going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I think basically that seems to be the lifelong work. Like, you could say that the work of a lifetime for everyone that has a lot to do with, I would say, character development, that's a loaded term, but if you grant it to me, is learning how to be intrinsically motivated in the midst of external temptation. And in some respects, that might have a thymotic element as well, because there's a challenge there, and you have to fight. You have these external temptations you're fighting against, and I actually think it can start to scratch that thymotic need a little bit. To the zillion-dollar question of leaving the cave in the first place, which in the paper we'll talk about the Overman and the allegory of the cave. A lot of people, there's a really important detail in the Plato's famous book 7 coming out of the cave story, which is the guy is
Okay, so we had a slight technical difficulty there. Daniel fell into the cave.
Yeah, I did. I was playing harmonica down there. We actually learned apparently you can't pick up on any of this on Zoom because of the frequency. Just for all the people out there who thought their harmonica career was going to take off, I'm sorry. Zoom will not allow it.
So I felt in real life, IRL or nothing.
So I
Um,
was saying something about external motivation, internal motivation, blah blah blah.
yeah. So I think I got the gist of what you were saying anyway.
Cool.
So we have this kind of challenge, we could say, of moving in and out of the cave, and you're proposing that it's difficult. I think you're right about this. It's difficult to go out of the cave. It's actually going back into the cave is possibly as hard, if not harder, than leaving the cave, right?
Yep.
So
Sure.
I 100% understand that, because you'll, especially from a philosophical perspective, we tend to go into our little zones of internal dialogue, and then sometimes you go back into kind of social settings, and you're like, oh my, because it's almost like anxiety. You're like, oh my god, these people are in the matrix, and especially like if you go, for example, from studying philosophy, if you study, like, I'm not saying universities provide anymore
Sure.
provide genuine thought spaces, but philosophy, I think, a bit more than the rest of them. And if you go from that, for example, into like a regular workplace, or let's say you studied BA philosophy and you did a master's in, I don't know, whatever, finance or something, a lot of people will resonate with this, because you're suddenly getting thrown back into the cave. Basically, you're getting thrown back into the cave. You're like, oh my god, this is really difficult. And I think what it is a little bit is, um there's this beautiful analogy in Plato's Phaedrus. And I think Nietzsche and Plato can be, almost brothers in arms here a little bit, because
Sure.
there's a great analogy in the Phaedrus where, the soul, the chariot goes up, 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 and Plato describes, basically the realm of recollecting the perfect forms, but he describes it kind of like a threshold. So it's like above the realm of the heavens, or he says something like his kind of celestial analogy. So it's almost like once you've escaped the cave, you've seen the horizon, and then you're going back into the world of people who haven't seen the horizon yet. And it's like they live. It's like, do we have sunglasses here anywhere? I don't think I do. Or do I? I think I do. You have sunglasses?
I'll
Yeah,
put that on this.
it's like the sunglasses thing. It's like, oh my god, like once you've seen it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
And like, I don't want to be melodramatic or anything and just say, just because you've read some philosophy books, that you're enlightened and other people are stupid. Like this, it's not what I'm trying to say. um uh, there is just a kind of sociological problem with
Yes.
with a heightened self-awareness, just like when people take drugs and they go into the supermarket, they're like, oh my days, this is
Yeah.
crazy, right? So obviously that's a kind of chemically induced
Sure.
version, and this is like a lifelong, much more authentic kind of project, but nonetheless, there's a kind of jarring distinction that occurs. And the reason I wanted to bring up the cave thing too is because, in They Live, and I know Zizek's done a very good analysis of this, the scene where they're fighting is like, put on the sunglasses, and the guy's like fighting him back, and he's like, I'm not doing it, and it leads to this like 10-minute fucking brawl, and you're like, wow, like this is difficult. And I definitely think that like philosophy hasn't, like everything, philosophy, psychology, everything hasn't taken seriously this move from outside the cave into the cave, which is kind of necessary because we're all human and we can't just live on our own in the woods. Maybe we could have a philosophical commune, and there is a kind of monastic thing there, like monks
Yeah.
living in a monastic setting, and perhaps that we've lost understanding of these distinctions between like, let's say, the kind of priestly or monk class and the regular people, because we don't have monasteries anymore. We don't have those ways of lives anymore. And I'm not saying because philosophers should necessarily live those. I have no problem with people trying to live those if they want to, but there's still a need to go back and forth. And I definitely think that Plato is trying to remedy that problem in a lot of his dialogues at the same time as thinking philosophically. He's also thinking in the sociological problem. And I want to bring up one contemporary issue where this is revealing itself. So you've had in the past, let's say, few years, more emphasis on self-improvement. And self-improvement does have a quasi-philosophical understanding to it, albeit in kind of modern terms, with
Sure.
all of the kind of problems that come along with that. But so you have like Jordan Peterson figures who are encouraging self-improvement and self-responsibility. And I think that there's a misunderstanding, I think, that not trying to put people off that journey, but I'm just saying there's a misunderstanding that we have with that when you pursue this for long enough, you will somehow find your place in society through this. I think this is a kind of therapeutic deception almost, right? And actually, no, the more you improve yourself, the more actually it's potentially the more alienated you're going to be.
That's right.
The more the more anxiety you will experience, even potentially, with this going into the supermarket while you're on mushrooms and no one else is taking mushrooms, to use the analogy of that, right? And this is a problem which I don't think any of us have really thought through. So I'm glad to hear it being discussed here. Just to wrap up that part, the problem of this movement in and out of the cave, extremely difficult. Yeah.
I think that was all excellent. A few things come to mind. I sometimes wonder, to mention the great Sloterdijk, that you've done work on this as well. I sometimes wonder if the choice is between having monasteries or ending up in zoos, because it's like everyone is now in zoos, right? That he talks about. And, I was thinking about too, like you look at modern suburbia, it's like, here's your little yard and you do this, it has a zoo structure, obviously the cubicles. And what's so interesting is, a lot of people will be like, oh, there's something very social about suburbia or modern life. We're around people, we're working with people. But ironically, the monastery, I know Rob Dreiner talks about the Benedict option, but there is something about that impulse. I don't know about the Benedict option as a whole. That's a more complicated topic. It has to be considered. But there's an idea that a defense of the monastery is a fight against the zoo. And you're going to have, and another way to look at that is a monastery is a quote unquote useless space. And I know the great Joshua Hansen has put up that extraordinary book on the tractates. I haven't finished it, but it's magnificent. And we talked before on Julian Benda in The Treason of the Intellectual. And this kind of idea that if there's no useless space in society, then you're going to be captured. There's no space to defend humanity. And actually, honestly, in my opinion, classical conservatism was at its best when it tried to defend a useless space, like a Russell Kirk, obviously a Roger Scruton. A lot of modern conservatism, not all, does unfortunately, I think, fall into the pitfall you've identified with Jordan Peterson, which is an unintentional therapeutic. It doesn't mean to. There is some defense of, say, masculinity, the family, and different things. But there's also a certain the more you are personally responsible, the more you'll fit into your community. Well, there aren't givens, though. That's the issue. Maybe in the past, when it was given what constituted the fitting in, so be it, but that's not given. And that's the sociological difference that has to be taken seriously. I think, if I'm being charitable, this is something that Deleuze is suggesting when he talks about lines of flight. And he's like, you're going to be more unintelligible. Now, Justin Murphy makes the point that becoming more unintelligible is not the same as becoming obscure. Deleuze is not telling everyone to become obscure, but I'm afraid many given Deleuzians have actually taken it that way and they've become obscure. And also, I think Deleuze almost suggests that having your own line of flight, I think it's kind of, we need to see it as inherent in the philosophical process itself, not like an additional thing that you add to the philosophical process. I mean, in a sense, if by philosophy you mean the academic structure of philosophy, you must add the line of flight. But I think the point you're getting at, where it's kind of like they live, where then you see everything differently. And here's the trick. Once you see everything differently, you can never go back to not seeing it differently. That's the key.
It's a threshold. It's a threshold.
It's a threshold. It's exactly what you were saying. The image I've used to describe that is at the end of Nabokov, his autobiography, Speak Memory. He talks about one of those pictures that has all the small pictures, and there's a big one. There's a big picture made up of all the small ones if you just position yourself right in the room and then you see it. He's like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Those kind of optical illusion things. And that's what ends up happening. Like, once you do thinking long enough, then you just see it all. And as we know from Philip Reef, givens were defending people from ending up in that situation. And now, without givens, everyone is released. They've all got the glasses on, or they have more of the glasses on than not. And everyone is responding to that with oh, this sucks, I don't want it. Or they're fighting against the glasses with too much of a nostalgic background. Or they're putting on the glasses and actually becoming cynics. Where you say, oh, there's kind of a form of glasses like they live. But then there's another form that is like seeing through everything, which almost is different from seeing the truth of things. There's like this kind of deconstructional, like you can't trust anything. Here's the problem with that. That's almost therapeutic, where you can't trust anything at all. Like everything you can deconstruct, all institutions, all family structures are bad, because then you don't have, then you understand everything. That's therapeutic, right? So there's this form of like double reactions to putting the glasses on of fight, like ripping them off and pretending like you didn't see anything, and then you exist in that Sardian bad faith. But then there's another form of putting on the glasses and then almost finding like the glasses that like make everything something you don't have to think about, because when you have the glasses on and they live, it's not that everyone's an alien, right? There are some truth out there. That's, you have to do some work. It's almost like another way to deal with this problem is to find glasses that makes everything an alien. Everything is bad. There's not, well, then that's actually therapeutic. And that's, to me, to close the point, I think a temptation in this state is, and we were talking a little bit about it in Zarathustra, where you had that video on the doomer in Zarathustra. There's a way in which the therapeutic is always trying to sneak in different ways, right? It's always like lurking. Just when you think you've spotted it, there it is again. There it is again. And there actually is a form of the therapeutic that comes in doomer. Like if everything is power, like it's just Foucaultian power, it's all fake and it's all construct. Well, obviously there's a lot of truth to that, but even we have to compare the early Foucault with the later Foucault. But if you just kind of monotheory it and say, oh, everything is construction, that's actually therapeutic, because then you don't have to think about anything anymore, right? Like you're done, you're settled. And that leads to the doomer structure as well. There can be a therapeutic in the doomer. Like we don't have to do anything. Well, why do anything? Because we're all doomed, or it's all going to be taken over by power. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. And even though you have to like come to terms with those realities, there's a danger of a new kind of therapeutic coming up that has to be fought against. And then just to connect it with Zarathustra, I think Zarathustra is an example of all the sneaky ways the therapeutic can come back into your life that you have to fight against and watch out for. You can find it in the philosopher role. You can find it in the cave or outside the cave, but you can, by avoiding the movement, you don't have it so much. So what you were saying just makes me think of like all those different ways that the therapeutic can sneak in without people realizing it.
Yeah, great. And I think that your example of the glasses being, too cynical, or the glasses showing everyone to be an alien, being another version of being in the cave, is good, because the biggest movement in and out of caves today is probably online, in real life. Like that's one of the biggest ones, especially if you're involved in Twitter or Substack or YouTube, whatever it is. Where there's a kind of a higher level thinking or a higher level awareness around certain things, whether that be political, red pilling, black pilling, and so forth. And this is a good example because we're going into a kind of informational network in order to find other people who aren't aliens, and we're going into a kind of inhuman network in order to find people who aren't aliens. It's like there's no escape. So it's really, really, it's a very complicated problem. And what was I going to say? Hold on. I wrote something down. Yeah. So there's this theme here between, I think, resistance to the external impositions, the what's the term you used again? I can't remember the term.
Intrinsic motivation, external motivation,
So like
extrinsic.
Bestowcentrism versus the intrinsic, and so on. We can say like there's kind of a resistance to the bestowcentrism, and then on the other side there is a conformity, and Zarathustra's definitely, he's kind of stuck in the middle of these two things, and he reminded me a little bit of actually Achilles. Achilles is since most of the Trojan War by the benches on the bench, like by the ships. He's not fighting, right? And he spends most of his time in this kind of Zarathustrian frustration, nearly, of like, I want to participate, but that fucking Agamemnon is humiliating me and not treating me the way I deserve to be treated. And his pride is getting in the way, but like he cannot be other because he's a warrior. Like he has to be proud. And he's in this frustrated position. And of course, eventually he is reconciled with the community because of Patroclus's death and so forth. So there's also a kind of movement in and out of the community there. And I think that there's I want to bring up a kind of hierarchical component to this, because in the Iliad, obviously Achilles is the best warrior, but he's excluded from the community, and it is somewhat his own fault because it's his own pride, but it's also Agamemnon mishandling the situation for his own pride. So you have this problem, and I see that with Nietzsche as a person and Zarathustra as a figure, this difficulty with the community and finding an acceptable place within it. And it's a very psychoanalytical theme here too, because we have to find some sort of place in society, but then the superego imposes too much on us. We feel, castrated, we feel lowered by it, and we have to try negotiate that. So there's a sort of, there's a kind of task here. But what I think, and just because I brought up psychoanalysis, what I think psychoanalysis hasn't taken seriously enough is the vertical and the hierarchical component to that, because to use Achilles as an example, the Greek army nearly gets destroyed by Hector because Achilles isn't involved, right? Yes. It takes Achilles to get involved to save them. And I think you can see the same thing with Zarathustra. Nihilism, last man, delusion, derangement, no one sees the aliens, and you need the prophet or the philosopher or the warrior. You need this exceptional figure to kind of shake people up or like to like step in. But there's a lot of difficulty to this stepping in. And, so, and what I like about Nietzsche, what I like about Zarathustra is that he frames this more sociological problem of the individual and the community, of the extrinsic motivation and the intrinsic, through this hierarchy or through this threshold of the Übermensch. The Übermensch is this project of becoming, and it's this possibility and potentiality of which you need Achilles, of which you need the Julian Assanges, of which you need the Jesuses of too. You need these Zarathustra's of. You need these annoying figures who don't cooperate necessarily the way you want them. They don't do things efficiently and cooperatively, but they're exceptional, and you need them. And if you don't have them, bad things happen, right? And I think that so I'm not sure where to go with that, what to make of that, but that's just some observations.
Well, if you wanted to be really spicy, we could talk about Atlas Shrugged, because that book is one giant testament to Nietzsche. Now, it's hard to talk about Ayn Rand anymore because everyone so quickly has certain ideas and notions, and she's defending neoliberalism or capitalism or blah, blah, blah. First off, I'm actually always interested. Like, the very fact that so many conservatives heard the name Karl Marx and threw up made me really interested in it. I was like, why would they have such a strong reaction against it? If it's false, what do you care? Likewise, the fact that Ayn Rand is so, like, you mentioned that name and people lose their minds, that made me interested in it. I was like, well, that's interesting. Why is that? One of the key points that I think I would just bring out is I think Galt's Gulch, which is where all the super people are gathered, the Ubermeshes basically, is not the Fortune frickin' 40 under 40 or Fortune 500 or the top CEOs or all of these different people. The conflation of a John Galt or a Reardon or a Francisco, I don't want to ruin the book, so I won't give anything away. But I think, you know enough about it that there are these superhumans and blah, blah, blah. Because they're very famous. I actually know
like literally nothing about it for some reason.
So really?
Yeah, this is all new to me.
Oh, I would suggest you read it. I would definitely suggest you read it. I think it's an extraordinary book, honestly. And I think it's an extraordinary book. I really do. I think if all she ever wrote was the money speech, with Francisco and 380 or whatever. I mean, that's unbelievable. That little speech. It's an extraordinary book. But I will warn you this. I think it is a book that's almost impossible to understand now because we cannot help but read it as a defense of capitalism is today. She's all about in that book that you can't even talk about capitalism unless you have sound money. Like if money is not sound, like it's not today in the fiat system, most of the main villains are bankers and CEOs. So it's not like business versus government. It's way more difficult than that. But the key point is a lot of people associate John Galt with someone like Elon Musk or someone like that. Like he's like, oh, he's defending these giant tyrants or, you know, these great businessmen or whatever. It's a terrible reading of the Galt. I would say Galt is supposed to be the children of Zarathustra, basically. Like that Zarathustra like leaves us, my children will come, my children will come. Well, that's what she's trying to show you in the Galt. So what do we see in the Galt? Basically the whole book is about the love of life. It's not about money. It's not about being rich. It's about being rich in life. And it just happens to be the case that Ayn Rand thinks the proper economic system, if done correctly, here's the key principle that I was talking with Jacob and Bethany about, is that, and they're great. I love those guys. I love those people. And is that she believes the name of the game is making sure that the value of the economy is always aligned with the virtue of the individual. And she sees that as possible in a classical free market system, but she saw that the free market also tended to separate them. And once that occurred, you were screwed. And today she'd be like, the system's screwed because we've separated the virtue of the individual from the value of the economy. But that's her whole assumption, is that you have the possibility of bringing those together. And that's why she talks about the economy like she does. And it's just a much more complicated picture. But the key is that in Galt's, what do you see? You see these very successful people in the world who, here's the key, the whole book is about how the only way that what she calls the looters or the kind of poisonous society that's destroying everything is able to survive is because basically the overmen are there. They stay in the world. And so they're using the wealth or the trains that these people create while critiquing them and while being last men. The argument of the book is that the last men can only stay the last men if there are overmen who let them. Like who let them be taken advantage of and let them kind of receive society. If all of them leave, then the whole world falls apart. So John Galt is basically engaged in a process of having them all leave, because the only way to convince the last men that they are the last men is to make them face what would happen if there were only last men. That's the story of the book. I don't believe I've actually ruined it for you, because that's obvious. That's the plot. And also great literature. And I do think it's a work of great literature. You can't ruin, even if you know what's going to happen in it, it doesn't matter, right? They have that magic about them. So that's what the book is about. But the key is, so you have these you have these leaders of industry, these very rich people. And what are they doing in Gulch? They're hatching their own eggs from chickens. They're butchering their own bacon. They're working as a janitor because they're so excited. Like, you don't see Gulch is not defined as this place of super money, even though you see it as a place where people are living their own lives according to their own values and actually living life, and they're just not fake, right? This is why it's so dangerous today to associate the Gulch with, again, New York or something. Now, Ayn Rand wouldn't necessarily say New York is bad, but she would say the key principle is the love of life. Is it not the case that there's so much where you're just leave me alone? That defines the world. Just leave me alone. I'll read my philosophy. I'll do my work. I'll take care of things. Just don't try to control me. You don't want the system to control you. I'll just do my work. I'll just do my values. I'll just have my community. And what I think Ayn Rand is trying to show, what she's trying to show, is that basically you have no possibility of friendship, full life, true life, unless you have these kind of Nietzschean values. Without becoming, you can't have this fullness of life that you see in the Gulch. But what she also shows you is if all the people capable of that becoming leave, the world falls apart. So here's the question. Assuming all that the people who do becoming don't, they could all leave, a kind of exodology of an Alexander Bard or something. There could be a kind of exodus. That might be the case, which might be a repetition of Galt, and maybe it comes to that. But if the question is, and this is what Belonging Again Address has to be about, if the question is, what would it mean to maintain the spread of childhood, Nietzschean childhood, becoming, et cetera, so forth, without an isolationist strategy, what would that look like? Because it definitely requires the becoming, but the problem is the people who are capable of the becoming only can understand themselves as doing that, where everyone who's not engaged in that thinks those people are crazy, and yet it's those people that make it possible for those looters, as Rand would say, to be there to call them crazy. So then there's like this antagonistic relationship that seems to necessarily define society. And the thesis, a way to look at Nietzsche, I would say, is the following. When God existed, you always had a higher power that could kind of keep that antagonism from destroying everything. Because even if the becomers were like, these people suck, but I'm doing this for God's sake, so even if they don't understand, it's okay. And these people, like, there was always a kind of structure there that could avoid ultimate self-destruction because you could believe in higher values. What Nietzsche understands is if God's not there and you have this kind of antagonistic structure, then if Zarathustra is not going to stay in the cave, which would be the Gults, you could think of it the Gults, and it's going to be in the midst of people, this is an entirely new problem that has not been thought, that is really, really difficult, and Zarathustra can be seen as wrestling with it the entire time, and wondering if there's any hope for it or can it be done. I think Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged does give us a blueprint of what it would look like to engage in an isolationist response to this problem. Now, the book ends with John Galt drawing the dollar sign, and now we return to rebuild everything or whatever. Well, now I have ruined the book. Not really, I don't think. But, so there is that question. But to maintain becoming in the midst of the world, this is arguably the hardest thing. And that's what, like, belonging, again, if we explain that everyone is now in this situation with the collapse of givens and releases, and you have these philosophical consciousness spreading, what would it look like to then address that situation and not have an isolationist strategy? I think it's an unbelievably pressing problem.
Yeah, no, that is quite good. I think I will check out Atlas Shrugged now. I was one of those people who just assumed it was some sort of like literary celebration of capitalism or something. So.
Sure, and look, like it's one of those things where in some ways it is, but it's not so simple. Like we always the problem was, let me say this, I'll just say this quickly. The problem with Ayn Rand is there's a whole lot of ifs. If you have sound money, if X, Y, and Z, then, well, those kind of clauses are hard to keep in mind. And basically, if you don't, then it's very easy to read it as extremely naive. Now, there are criticisms of the book, which is to say that there's no such thing as John Galt, you could say. There's no such people like that. Or you could say, well, if you get rid of the Federal Reserve, it will cause a global financial crisis, so you can't go back to sound money. Okay, that's all fine, but that's not what's the case once he's writing. Right? Like you could say, oh, Julian Brenda is defending uselessness. He's saying that work is bad. No, it's not so simple. Like language changes, meaning changes, things are more complicated than that. And so no, it seems like it is. And honestly, I'm actually extremely critical of how a lot of like modern Republicans read the book or defend the book, because it's very, very, in my opinion, simplistic. It's just kind of like pro-libertarianism in a very kind of mundane way. So I don't think most people, now, of course, I'm not saying I'm the one with the truest interpretation, blah, 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 but I am saying that I think a lot of what you hear about the book online or from various institutes is really, really simplistic. Just like when you read about Nietzsche in an existential reader, right? You open up the existential reader, you get this take on Nietzsche, and it just leaves out everything, right? I think the same thing actually happens with Rand a lot.
Yeah. And I think we're starting to realize how much more complicated our kind of left-right maps are, because and actually this is something that Fukuyama points out in The End of History. He says that actually the reason communism, which was this supposedly very egalitarian project, was successful in the East and not in the West, was because the East was more tolerant to hierarchies, yes. Right? Because what did communism end up with, despite its egalitarian rhetoric? It ended up with, it probably did end up with like, people weren't going into massive debt for health problems, right? Sure. But and these are serious problems in the Western world, and particularly in the US. But you had this egalitarian ideology, but then you had these kind of almost like philosophy kings, like Lenin was almost like a kind of, well, I wouldn't really call him a philosopher, but he was smart. He was smart enough, and he had some decent books. And like you have these strange contradictions emerging where the ex-Soviet countries are now much more accepting of traditional hierarchy and custom, And the capitalist Western countries are wanting to do away with every kind of hierarchy, every kind of role. So yeah, like these paradoxes really need to be thought through better. But just going back to Nietzsche and Zarathustra, where will I go with this? I think maybe because you mentioned the isolationist response, and I think that maybe we can try delve into the isolationist response, because I'm also a little bit skeptical of this response, although I'm deeply skeptical of the kind of hyperconformity response or anything like that too. So but
Yeah.
but I think we should pick on the isolationist response here, because I think clearly modernity has stopped the higher and the lower working harmoniously together, and that relationship's kind of being destroyed. There is no, the Achilles who is necessary. There's no longer a reconciliation of Achilles with the rest of the society. Zarathustra never finds. I haven't finished Zarathustra, but in this analogy, Zarathustra never finds his place. You have this frustration of people that are maybe more Ubermensch inclined. You have this deeper alienation between, let's say, the higher and the lower, and you have this kind of as Nietzsche would say, this kind of victory of mediocrity, and there is an isolationist response, and I think some of the dangers of the isolationist response can be like serious self-referentiality.
Yes.
So, like modernity, as you mentioned, Peter Sloterdijk earlier. Peter Sloterdijk will talk about modernity being one giant self-referentiality project, and this is, I think, quite clearly problematic. There's an element we have to remember with Nietzsche, that he is also quite Dionysian, and Dionysians like company. Dionysians like festivity. They like wine drinking. They like libidinally charged situations. They like, this requires people. This project of becoming requires a master. It requires comrades. It requires lovers. It requires children or students. We, as again, to refer to Plato, as Socrates says in the Alcibiades, he says that he is also elevated by teaching the student. It's not just the student being elevated; he is also elevated. It's good for his soul too. So we have a necessity for sociality and coexistence, which is necessary for this Ubermensch project itself. And I think reading Zarathustra, you can see that Nietzsche is not this idiot individualist. He's aware of the problem. He's probably aware from his own personal experience of being a very isolated individual of the limitations of that. So yeah, just thoughts on that kind of necessity of sociality and necessity of coexistence.
I think these are basically the most difficult sociological problems we have to deal with today. Like, this is the issue, basically. That's a little strong, but it is. It's all suggesting the problem of scaling childhood, if we use childhood in the Nietzschean sense. Spreading philosophical dexterity and skill to not be susceptible to control, systems of control in a Deleuzian way, or the zeitgeist of neoliberalism, if we use that in the negative sense. Although, again, neoliberalism is a tricky word because that means a lot of things to a lot of people and can become a boogeyman. So we have to be careful with that. So it's all very tricky. I think it's really astute to say that Nietzsche is not a naive individualist, and that it's all about the festival. You mentioned the Dionysus, the birth of tragedy, the Apollo, the famous Dionysus and Apollo dichotomy. It's very important. It's also just one last thing on Rand. Like, people call, like, they understand her individualism quite naively and quite stupidly, and accuse her of thinking these really dumb things, like you would never help anyone. Galt is a giant gift to all the people he invites there. The issue is that she doesn't think that you should be able to guilt people into helping you, like using ethics and value as a way to control people. Basically, her whole thing is that all interactions between human beings should be negotiated, spoken out, and agreed to. It should not be, it should always be negotiation or discussion. You could even talk about almost a Habermasian sort of thing, which he may throw up to associate him with Rand. I don't know. But this kind of idea that I'm not going to say, hey, Owen, let's have a podcast conversation because you owe me. Rand would say that's evil, basically. I would say, hey, Owen, let's have a podcast conversation. I think you have value and I'd like to have you, and say, oh yeah, Daniel, I'd like that. I think it'd be a good conversation because I think you've done work on Nietzsche. So we agree to do it in terms of shared values. That's what Rand would say. That's the only way to fight some form of totalitarianism, whether it be the market, the state, doesn't matter. Once it becomes possible for people to compel one another to action by means beyond their own agreement, then you're at risk of control. That's the defense of the individual, is the defense of the ability of people to engage in communal action only on those terms, right? So it's not a simplistic individual selfishness, even though now you could argue she uses that language and so she shoots herself in the foot and she makes her message more difficult to understand, but it's not naive in the same way it's not with Nietzsche. I think so a way that I would frame this to critique the isolationists, we can think of the Gulch. Let's say the Galt option, as I've described it with Rand. So you have the Galt option, you have the Benedict option, you have let's even add the Guru option, which is the wise man that goes off in the forest you never hear of again. The Brahmin. We'll mention the Brahmin. Maybe we'll talk about succession, right? Like succeeding from the state. All of these are kind of isolationist strategies, right? They're not all the same, but there's something isolationist about it. As you could even, I guess, add the Amish, the Mennonites, something like that, where you're just very withdrawn, you're withdrawing. That I'm not going to say those don't work. Those easily could be a proper address to the current situation. So this is not to say the isolationist strategy, it's very important. No one is saying isolationist strategies don't work. You could even add to the succession option some of the fourth political theory by Dugin, which I know you've done work on. These are the kind of ideas that if you're part of the global order, you're screwed by definition. There's a kind of succession that's part of it, like the American South and so on and so forth. Now, of course, the problem with succession is it can be used to perpetuate a problem or to create a breaking down of political alliances. But it is a way to address the monolith of the giant self-reference that is modern life, right? It is an address. But is it the address we want? Here's the issue. I don't think political scientists and political thought and sociologists in general have thought this. Here's the issue. When anyone proposes the isolationist options, the response tends to be that's bad, or that's evil, or that's bad. Okay, well, what's your alternative? It hasn't been thought. Like, the alternative is to be in the midst of the difference and yet maintain your own integrity in that difference and then not be antagonistic. I would associate this a little bit more with maybe, and that would make possible the festival because you have the socializing. So the other option we can think about might have a little bit to do with like the Kierkegaardian night of faith, right? Which would be for someone to be an overman in the midst of everyone, and there'd be many overmen in the midst of everyone, but you can't tell who they are. They're invisible for Kierkegaard as the night of faith. They're there, but they're also invisible.
It's like Batman.
Yeah, basically.
Because like
that's exactly right.
Like, he's not known by Bruce Wayne. It's this Dark Knight. He has got no recognition, So
that's exactly right. And that seems to be inclusion. What it seems to have to be is you have to have an inclusion and yet distinction. That seems to be the political science structure or sociological structure that has to be considered here. And that's what I think Zarathustra is basically exploring constantly. The possibility of, can there be distinction and yet inclusion? Can the overman be part of the world and maintain being an overman, or is it impossible? And here's the trick, can the economy, can the political structure think of itself as creating a space where overmen can be invisible and in peace, where non-overmen can benefit from the overmen being there in a manner that increases the likelihood of they being overmen, thus making a festival for all to be involved? Well, this is politics of thinking about creating a garden of that, and they would have to accept the philosophical paradigms of a Nietzsche and all of this to even be possible, but that seems to be the political project you would have to engage in. And I think all of the isolationist strategies, they're thinking something like that, But then the question is, okay, well, where do you get your money from in the Benedict option? Okay, the economy. All right, well, you've got a connection then with the neoliberal.
Yeah.
So this is the tricky problem. I think the difficulty of this problem cannot be overstated.
Yeah. It is. It's probably like the biggest problem I think today.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so few comments on that. Night of Faith. My reservations about the quiet Ubermensch is twofold because of Thymos and because of my knowledge of Thymos. Recognition, it's so social and it's quite public and it's quite it's not performative in a let me think, in a kind of stupid way or inauthentic way. There is rituals which are important, and those are often public and those are often quite explicit. And I do think the kind of dark night figure or the Night of Fate figure does show, because Kierkegaard was obviously a Protestant theologian. It does show a sort of connection to the divine, which has, I think, rejected ritual. And ritual, I think, is important because it has a kind of psychological power and a kind of psycho-developmental pull, which initiates us into what we are in such a powerful way that I think that the expectation for one to become an Ubermensch without some sort of social recognition, without some sort of ritualistic component, and without authority as well, because I think that overlooks the authority question. And authority is social. Like, I can't give myself authority because I'm secretly being the Ubermensch. Like, Batman is a fictitious story because the guy is just so powerful that he can do whatever he wants. But in real life, the FBI would track him down and arrest him. Like,
exactly right.
Because he doesn't have social authority to do what he's doing, and they wouldn't like that, and they would do their best to hunt him down. And like, I think that this Night of Faith problem overlooks the authority that's necessary to maintain those relationships of becoming, we can put it like that. And also, what was the thing I was going to say? The other thing I was thinking here was the first person out of the cave, because the first person out of the cave is self-motivated, right? And then the next person can be self-motivated to some degree, but he's also relating to this guy who's going, hey, buddy, like, get out of the cave. So he's relating to an external force. And this external force, and I think, again, Plato, the Republic, there's a political and authoritative component to this. Like, Plato's not saying walk around town and free everyone from their from their chains inside the cave. He's kind of saying we kind of need to, like, concretize this into a political order with power, legal and military and social power to concretize an educational system of becoming, we could say. So so those would be my critiques, basically. I can think of the isolationist approach.
It would be difficult for me to express my appreciation of your statements, because I think this is a serious conversation. I think basically everyone has fallen into the quietism structure of one or the other, and that doesn't address Thymos. Thymos is kind of the elephant in the room, honestly. The recognition thing, like, that breaks everything. If you ignore it, you're fine, but once it shows up, everything changes. So I appreciate it. Also, I think it's really quick. I don't think it's inherently bad at all if there's a guy who's intrinsically motivated who leaves the cave and that inspires other people to leave. That's not inherently bad. It can be more risky because the more bestowing that's present, the more risk there is, but it doesn't inherently mean it's bad. It's not inherently bad. There's just more risk of dependency. And theoretically, this would kind of be a point. Theoretically, if it's never possible for there ever to be a situation where there won't be at least some people who can leave the cave on their own, well, then we never have to worry about the society of control having ultimate control. But if it is theoretically possible for a day to emerge where no one can leave the cave unless somebody drags them out, then there is a point where control can be absolute. So this is a live question. I don't know. I don't know if it's something where just probability theory would have it that there will always be some percentage of people who are going to leave, even if they're dragged or not. I don't know that. It could be there always will be, so it's self-correcting. It could be that there's a likelihood of it not happening, or it can happen in pockets, but not the other pockets. So yeah, the society of control will never be absolute, but maybe it's 85%, right? And basically at that point, it is, it's practically very, very powerful. This is an extremely live question. This is an extremely consequential question. And my critique of the allegory of the cave is simply to say, we haven't thought it. Because the narrative has someone dragged, and then weirdly we remember the narrative as us just leaving on our own. Like that's what that whole paper, How Does Anyone Leave Plato's Cave, kind of starts with, is like, isn't it weird that all the video descriptions of the play, except Orson Welles, when he did a version of it, you see the guy getting dragged, but all the modern versions, they don't have a Morpheus, the retelling of the say they just leave on their own, and that's not actually what happens in the story. Well, that would suggest there's a theoretical problem where you somehow have to teach people to leave the cave without there being a teacher. What does that look like? Because you're completely correct. We need to read The Republic as a book on education, which we don't. That's been a mistake. Certainly book 7 with the allegory of the cave is. And that's a massive mistake. So a few things come to mind. I think basically there has to be a replacement. So we'll ask some questions back and forth, because this topic of the problem of the quiet overmen, I think, is one that is central to the work currently right now I'm belonging again to, which unfortunately after 7 years is 3,000 pages, and it's really terrible. But the question, like the sections like that we'll talk about in 2.1, because it's 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, it's like 2. Anyway, is the idea that first question, can YouTube be enough recognition? So let's say you're in the society of the quiet, no one, and your jobs are different things, but you do have online an alternative live. Do we think that would address enough of the recognition problem? These are almost more quick fire, because I'm interested, like, is that enough or not?
Yeah, okay. No, for 2 reasons. Now, I do think, as we're using the communicative tools, I think this is good. This is what we should be doing with these tools.
Sure.
But in terms of recognition, no, because it doesn't come necessarily with an authoritative component to it, because Excellent. It's not initiated into a locality like a nation or a town or a state. Whereas me getting my I don't know, like, I'm the mayor, I'm the chief of the police, whatever. Like, I'm getting recognized with some sort of official kind of social authority or legal authority. Now, I don't think that we should reduce recognition to legality or to power, anything like that, because it's also psychodevelopmental, it's also just psychological, and it will exist in the most hierarchical society, it will exist in the least hierarchical society, it will exist. So it's not reduced to convention, but convention is important. So it's the online world is negating locality, which is therefore negating the political question of authority. And then secondly, it's disembodied. And I just think that, like, again, it's kind of more of a Dionysian point again. Yeah. There's just something about, being around people in a really embodied sense, which gives you, and like, to give an example, the rise of the popularity of jiu-jitsu is exactly what this is. What do you get in jiu-jitsu? You get a belt. Right? So it's like, and it's becomes, and like people are, and like, it's very physical, obviously, and so on. So, and so basically the problem with it is it's not enough because of disembodiment and because of the lack of locality there for authority. Yeah.
Excellent answer. So another question. So first, on the jiu-jitsu, I find that fascinating. My beloved friend Paul started jiu-jitsu, and I wrestled for a long time, and cross country and long distance running, but I did jiu-jitsu. What blew my mind with jiu-jitsu is this weird, like, mechanical chessness to it. Like, when you do it, it's not like wrestling where there's a lot more uncertainty. In jiu-jitsu, it's like, I feel the arm, you win by getting the person to tap. right? So it's very like, it feels perfect for overthinking people because they have all these thoughts and they're looking for a form of physicality that's also very mental. So I was speaking with the great Drew Drew, who runs a jiu-jitsu, and I almost want to talk about the phenomenology of jiu-jitsu because there's something there in it that speaks to the modern man. But let me get back to the topic.
Michael Millerman does jiu-jitsu as well.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I did not know that. Oh, interesting. Well, there's something about, I really liked it and I had never done it before and I thought it was super cool. So it's cool. But let me ask you this. So if I were to call the online spaces that we're all in and do, some people call it the liminal web. We have to use some term, that's fair. So there's a way in which the liminal web is better than nothing, but we would also say it's not sufficient, right? Is that fair? We'd say it's better than nothing, but it's not sufficient, right? Okay, I think that's fair. Can you have recognition without certification? Is recognition possible without certification?
Depends what you mean by certification. I mean, certification in the explicit sense of here's your degree, here's your license to drive or something, like it's like those very kind of bureaucratic mechanisms of certification are like you can have recognition without those. But I do think that even without the official legal custom, we could say, of certification or the kind of professional qualification of certification, you still have a sense in which someone's becoming, I think, is bound to. I wouldn't use the word certification because it seems bureaucratic to me. But for example, trust, right?
Yeah.
So for example, if you have a relationship with authorities that no matter how, whatever, it could be parents, it could be teachers, it could be bosses at work, that for some reason never trust you to do anything, this is extremely difficult for people, like obviously for obvious reasons, because it's almost like you're not recognizing that I am capable of something. So, and like there's no legal certificate involved. There's no professional certificate involved. But it's kind of a certification because it's a kind of bestowing, as you would put it, but a bestowing not of a merely like a moral convention, but a bestowing of like, we actually trust what's going on inside you. I think that's important. Like, it's obvious today in a very risk-averse society, which is becoming increasingly infantilized, that there's a lack of authority, which is, there's plenty of authority telling you what to do, but there's no authority in which gauges with you in a sense in which it's like, okay, we're giving you, let's say, an external conventional authority, but it's not merely pushing something on you. It's an external conventional authority which is facilitating you to think for yourself or to trust your own decision or your own movements more.
Yeah. Excellent. That's an excellent answer. I actually think one of the problems today is that people don't trust certification, and therefore it doesn't have this recognition. Oh, you went to a college? That doesn't mean anything anymore, right? Or it's lost. Like the connection between certification and recognition has been severed. But problematically, if you don't have a degree, it's hard to get X job and to be recognized as doing anything. So there's this weird thing where getting you a position in the community can be an act that is no longer necessarily tied to recognition or a certainty of recognition. People start to wonder, oh, maybe I have this job not because I'm trusted, but simply because I have the credentials. And maybe I have the credentials, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It might or might not. I think that's very astute. Does this mean that recognition is ultimately trust?
Well, it depends on whose theory of recognition, like, because there's the Kohevi, master slave interpretation of Hegel. There's Hegel, there's Plato, there's Nietzsche, there's Homer. You know what I mean? Like, it's Fukuyama. It totally depends on whose theory of recognition you're.
Well, let's put it this way. No, that's very fair. That's very fair. I'm being vague. Trust in the sense of, I know that people think I can, almost. Like, I feel like the people around me think I can fill in the blank. And it seems that, it's like that feeling of, because it's not like, to be trusted is not merely to be trusted, but to feel trusted.
Yeah.
And it's trusted not in this kind of personal, like, oh, they trust me not to slap them. Okay, that's very low level, and I don't even know what that is. That's almost not even trust. That's almost just like decency or whatever. It's almost like the problem
It's just
today.
civility, you know.
Yeah, actually part of the problem here, I do think, and we did have a paper on trust and belonging again, but it's like people define trust as civility. But that's not what trust is. Trust has more of a capable of, and that's thymotic now.
Yeah.
Now you're talking about something that's thymotic. Oh, people think I have the strength to fix the car, or the capacity to make sure the house is together, or the ability to take care of the future. And what people don't respond, like you're not recognized, you don't feel recognized in who you are without that trust. So if I meant trust like that, do we think that has more to do with recognition?
Yeah, no, I really like the way you've connected those two things there. Because we're talking of self-belief as well. And the problem with self-belief is the self-belief is so entangled. I wouldn't say it's I'm referring back to the issue with self-referentiality. The reason self-referentiality can be good, and referring obviously to the master-slave dialectic, is that it can somehow get self-belief or self-trust when it's missing conventionally. But nonetheless, we have to think about how important the convention is and how important the sociality and the ritualism of that trust is. But as you were saying very correctly, this isn't just a certificate. This is a phenomena of, I believe in myself. I can do this because someone has kind of like almost existentially opened up the possibility for you that they can do that. And the problem with education today is that we're always coddling people, and that removes their imagination to do things, because too often to open up the imagination that you can do things, it's, we have this very kind of liberal and kind of libertarian view of like, you just be nice to people. Oh, you can do it. But no, sometimes it's, do it, bitch. Sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes it's like, it's an antagonism. It's a kind of more sturdy and more antagonistic, playful. Like I don't mean to humiliate, but like a kind of playful component, which sometimes you need to not undermine someone permanently, but undermine them or make fun of them or joust with them in a certain way, yes, which challenges them, right? It's not the humility, to sort of challenge them. And I think that we today think that anything like that is kind of abusive and humiliating. So we have problems with bestowing trust and teaching trust and invoking trust because we don't really know how to do that anymore. But yes, Thymos deals, I would say, both with the internal capacity for self-belief, self-trust, but also it's really, really bound to the conventional as well.
Excellent. So a thought that comes to mind is we have three categories. We have self-belief, self-denial, and self-esteem. And it seems that in order for us to be thymotically addressed, we have to be able to emotionally, experientially, individually feel as if we can tell the difference between self-belief, self-esteem, and self-denial. And let me explain what I mean by that. I can right now start telling myself, no, I'm able to fix the car, but I've never actually worked on a car. So that could just be self-esteem or self-denial or self-delusion. That might be a better term. Self-delusion, actually, I'll write that. Because I've never actually gone into the world to see or try the thing. I'm just telling myself that. So in one sense, it seems like self-belief, but actually, until I work on the car, I cannot meaningfully pull apart, make this like a meaningful distinction in my life to myself between self-belief, self-esteem, and self-delusion. Now, this is what's interesting to me, and this might help us understand why self-belief can't just be egotism. It's because it almost seems that without the other, whether it be the other person, the otherness of world, the otherness beyond the ego, whatever, it seems like without otherness, as more broad like that, there's no possibility of experience by which you could plausibly make a distinction in your mind to yourself between self-belief and self-delusion. Because there has never been a world in which you can go to experience for yourself that your self-belief is not self-delusion. Without the world, you could never go through those exercises or experience that then would work back on yourself, that when you go, I have belief in myself, and you have that little doubting voice that says, you're deluded, you say, no, I'm not. Because when I went in the world, I did fix that car. And when I went in my community, people did trust me. And you have evidence for yourself against that own doubting voice that you are self-deluded instead of self-believing. And if you can't to yourself separate self-delusion from self-belief, which is only possible via experience and challenge in the world, well, then you won't thymotically address yourself. The same problem happens with self-esteem. Well, if you're like, I'm a great person, I do have belief in myself, you can't tell if you're just inflating your ego and being therapeutic unless you go in the world where you say, yes, I actually can do that because I did do that. And people now trust me as a result of it. So there's a way in which the thymotic society must economically, socially, and educationally create spaces in which people can undergo experiences and challenges where self-belief, self-delusion, and self-esteem, and there may be others, but those three come to mind, can be pulled apart to the subject's own consciousness to themselves, that is then reinforced by it being pulled apart to other people. It's like, nah, Daniel's not self-deluded about fixing the car because he fixed mine. I saw him do it. Daniel's not crazy. That's not just meaningless self-esteem. Literally, this car here works now, right? And so what would a society... So the first thing, I have more to say, but I'm going to throw it back at you. What do we think about the idea of having to create experiences that meaningfully separate these things? Because right now it's almost like we don't have education where they're all conflated. We can't tell plausibly to ourselves when we're engaged in self-belief or self-delusion or self-esteem. They're all mixed. And so then we can't address the thymotic. The thymotic seems to require clarity. There's something about a clarity in the thymotic that's required. If you have any doubt that you have self-belief, then you won't, because doubt is the opposite of belief. So to have self-belief, there has to be a certain clarity, but the only way to get that clarity is with otherness, a world in which you can earn that clarity and the community can recognize it. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, you are speaking my language now. This is exactly the thing. Know thyself is a trial, right? Like the maximum to know thyself isn't like, do I rationally think about myself here as this static person that's read the becoming? It's a practice of trial. And to refer to the term, which is used to describe what Socrates is doing with stripping away our opinions, the Greek term, I think it's called elenkos, and it refers to a kind of psychic stripping. And this psychic stripping is a kind of trialing, because to use the armor theme, we have these armors, and our armors are important. I'm not saying that we should have no armors, because if we don't have armors, we can't really function. But psychic armors can also get in the way of us trialing ourselves and being in the world with that risk and being in the world with that challenge, because that's the only way we can know ourselves. And that's the only way we can do this task, which you're talking about, which is the separation of self-esteem, self-belief. And what was the third one?
I said self-delusion, self-belief,
yeah.
Self-esteem, self-delusion.
Yeah. Like the only way we can parcel these things out is by trial in the world, which involves some sort of risk. And I think we should evaluate the level of risk per individual. I don't think we should have a universal thing about that. I think we should be. And the problem with modern therapeutics is it hasn't done this, right? It's not doing this because it's too risk averse. And the awful thing that's going on right now with psychology is that people are now scared to refer to someone the wrong gender, for example, because they're going to have their license taken off them, so they can never challenge them. Like, it's pure armor. It's pure safety. And like, this is obviously a bit massive problem, because there's basically no way out now of actually thymotically helping people.
Well, Raymond, I really appreciate everything you said. Basically, for me, you cannot have an experiential distinction between self-belief, self-delusion, and self-esteem without risk. Like, risk is the only way to do it. If there's no risk in your life, then you cannot, to yourself, plausibly pull those things apart. Because you see, your entire life is a process of like them coming back together. Maybe you addressed thymos in your 20s, but now you're 34 trying to survive, and you can wonder, oh, am I still, am I still self-believing in myself, or have I drifted out of that, right? So like maintaining to yourself a plausible separation between those things, so you can know thyself according to the trial, which I think was a brilliant point. That seems to be so much central to all of this. And basically, we can look at the therapeutic as an attempt to make us forget about the need to keep those apart. Well, just don't think about it. Oh, don't think about it. Well, I do. Well, that's your problem. You just need to plug into the system more. And we're seeing that the Fukuyama, the experiment of make people not think about it doesn't seem to work, and hasn't worked, because might be part of our deepest nature. Please.
I was just going to say, this is the crisis of sublimation, in my opinion, because Fukuyama wants us to sublimate this anxiety about what we are into career and sports and hobbies. And it's just a liberal dogma that I just don't think is working. So anyway, continue.
Yeah, it doesn't seem possible. Yeah. It just does not seem possible. And even if it was, do we want it to be possible? Like, let's if people are doing it, then the thymos looks like becoming the super rich, business person, that BlackRock Vanguard that destroys the housing market. Like, why? Yeah. Let's say the people who do it according to the values by which they are doing it, the Achilles that follows that is going to be, everything that capitalism has become is the logical end of it, isn't it? It's like, I think it's quite silly to believe that you can have a free market small business system address thymos and do what Fukuyama is saying and not become giant corporations taking over the world. Isn't that the law? Isn't that what you should expect of people who are being Achilles in business? So it's an interesting notion, and look, it does seem to be the case that a certain percentage of people are able to do well in business, and that kind of addresses the need for recognition. But that almost, what's the big problem people talk about today? Access, inequality, like lower class. Well, those would all follow from a structure of recognition that requires success in the business structure. Like, recognition in terms of trust could be a non-zero sum game. Recognition in terms of the economy almost seems like it has to be a zero-sum game, does it not? Now, of course, wealth is created. Capitalism is not inherently zero-sum. That's a huge mistake of critics of capitalism. But the positions in the business, there's only one CEO, there's only one CFO, there's the positions of status which incur the recognition. That is a zero-sum game, unless you go make your own business. But how many people can do that without Google already owning all the intellectual property rights, or without getting crushed, or without your parents thinking you're an idiot in the majority? And look, the majority of entrepreneurs that succeed, that get recognition through that, is always going to be a minority. There are, Belonging Again will say all the time that obviously there are given individuals who can become Nietzschean children and address the thymotic concern. That's not the issue. It's the question of scale. What about the majority? Can the majority of people in 2023 have the thymotic needs met through the neoliberal order? The answer is no. It is not the case. And if it's not the case, then it doesn't work. Then it can't work as a world order. It could work as a New York order. It could work as a given set of people order. But as a world order, it cannot work. And that would then get you into some of Dugin's critiques and how there are many Daseins and all those different things that are very valid. But so what Fukuyama is saying is not that it's entirely false in every case of every individual. And it's also not the case that isolationist strategies don't work. The problem is they work enough to make it seem plausible to put them at scale, at which point they cease to work. That's what we've unveiled, right? Like, if Fukuyama's suggestion didn't work at all for no one, well, then you'd say, well, this is clearly false. You wouldn't do it. It works enough to make you think it will work in all cases, and then you expand it and you go, oh crap, it doesn't. And that's now what we are seeing. And like I said, that structure of thymotic address seems to be a zero-sum game, not a non-zero-sum game. And if it's a zero-sum game, that's not going to address the problem of scale. By problem of scale, I mean scaling the address of the thymotic. So I don't think so. But here's the thing, to kind of suggest what we're getting at. The thymotic seems to be addressed, if we want it to be addressed and it be non-zero sum. By non-zero sum, I mean, it's not like if you get it, I lose it, right? Zero sum is where if one person gets something, everyone else doesn't, right? So non-zero sum means everyone can win as a game theory structure. It would seem that the non-zero sum thymotic address would have to have something to do not with status, but with trust. And by status here, I'm going to be using that term in a special sense to refer to business status. If we're talking business status, that's a limited address. Do you agree with that principle? Let me ask you that. I shouldn't just say that. But it seems to me that if we want to address thymos through status, it can seemingly work to some degree, but it seems zero sum and it doesn't seem to work in all cases. What do you think of that? I'm not married to that position. That's my thinking.
Okay, so I think there's two kind of questions you're asking there. One was the zero sum and the other was the sublimation through capitalism.
Yes.
And those are obviously related, but they're kind of separate as well.
Sure.
So which will I handle first? Let's do the sublimation through capitalism first. We have to also think historically here. The task of thymotic recognition changes historically and drastically, and it changed drastically with the rise of a kind of merchant class capitalism, because you always have in society, no matter what society it is, especially in the Western world, a kind of military class, a kind of political or kind of intelligentsia class, and a more of a market merchant class. Now, there's all sorts of things which are in the middle of all those things, but those are the kind of Indo-European triad. And there's all sorts of things which blur the boundaries, and you put artists in this one, or whatever. There's a rough category. The capitalism is basically the era of the merchant class taking over, and therefore all of this all of the ways in which we get status are going to alter because of that. In medieval times, if a soldier was knighted, a huge recognition, right? And he doesn't do that through being a merchant; he does that through being a warrior, basically. In the church, it's done through a priestly structure and so forth. And obviously, Plato had his own kind of version of how this would be done in a philosophy society or a society run by philosophers. So you have these different, changes which go historically. At least one of the big problems with the capitalist model that I can see is that it does tend to stop sectarian violence in a way in which the priestly and the warrior hierarchies of status were prone to. And I think that's one of the successes of liberalism. But the problem is the success of that comes with other problems. So a lot of those problems, as you mentioned, BlackRock, the monopolization problems and so forth. One of the big problems with capitalist thymos is that it tends to be a structure in which, yes, you get status, yes, you get a job title and so forth. But there was a reason during the Renaissance, wealthy merchants were funding artists to build these big structures, because they kind of know that no matter how much money I make, that thing's beautiful. And this bank account isn't beautiful. So there's a problem of capitalism is you're never really getting the thing. You're getting the means to translate it into a thing. And then the means to translate it into a thing is problematic, because then it's well, am I just buying for this status? Am I really participating in it? Can I really believe in myself? And then also it's kind of a constant referral to external objects, and it's not a referral to the soul, or not I know it's a big bombastic term to use today, but you know what I mean? We can even say the psyche or the being or the person, whatever you want to use. But there's this constant reference to external objects, and it misses the point in which the desire for recognition is never going to be complete by it being attached to a specific thing, or even a specific achievement like getting a PhD or something. It's a move. It's like the Heraclitus River analogy. You know, it's this constant moving thing. So the other question was the zero sum, and this is like, because I think it's something that's intrinsic to our psyche. I would say no. It's not like it's not like to say, well, we can't all own this much money, because then the money would be of no value, because it's not attached to a specific quantity of anything. Right. It's not a scarcity problem in right. in that material sense, or in that financial sense. But there is a problem of, well, if we're all great, no one's great. You see what I mean? This is kind of Nietzschean problem. And again, Fukuyama brings this up in The End of History. He kind of says that basically, like, we don't want to dilute the currency, so to speak, of recognition. We don't want to pretend that we're all great, because this will actually mean that no one's great. So you have that problem with it. So yeah, those are the two.
Those are two really excellent answers. So in one sense, you could say that it's a big problem, because if there's ways for everyone to give recognition, then recognition is meaningless. But then there's a problem where if there's not enough modes of recognition or avenues, like they talk about wealth disparity. It's like there's not enough avenues for it, and maybe they're not diverse enough. Maybe the only roads of recognition are in money, but not enough in art, not enough in creativity, not enough in family. And maybe what it is everyone in their own differences has recognitions the others don't have. And that actually contributes to communal life, because everyone's like, I got all the money, but they're able to make the cathedral. And what you see there is actually an example. But then if you know that you can't have recognition in all areas, then the fact that you're missing that recognition can actually be easier to live with. And you also see that you do have recognition that they don't have. And here we see how recognition and individualism don't all, like a kind of egotistical individualism, don't have to go together, because you have recognition, but limits to that recognition that don't dilute the recognition because it's specified to your area of what you do in the communal life. It does seem more difficult to get the thymotic with. It seems more difficult to get, this is interesting, as a quick question, I'll go back at you because I have more to say on the other things you said that was so good. I wonder if it's more difficult to get thymos without community, because you can't determine the meaningful limits to recognition. You can't tell what you should and shouldn't be able to do, because it can't be in concert with other people of the community.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think that this thing is bound to the community. Okay, and there's two ways we can say it's bound to the community. One is true through kind of a pure relativism. So it's like, oh, these people are less than me, and I'm only great because these people are less than me. I'm only great because I say these people are whatever. So you're dependent on them you're dependent on, or referring to them in a certain way to make yourself greater. So I would say that's a kind of like a problem of social thymotic life, which is kind of which falls into the trap of pure relativism. And I would say that there's another sense in which the community is important for thymos, because, I mean, to use the obvious example, like take Napoleon, a megalo, as Fukuyama would call him, a megalothymia, someone who has an excessive thymotic desire for recognition, and it's bound towards something normally higher than others, not just equal to others. But I don't think we should also posit this as being necessarily purely relativistic inevitably. And I think that's also the problem of capitalism, because it tends to end up with relativism. They have these things and I want these things and so on. He wants to be the emperor. He wants to lead France to glory, but he wants to lead France to glory. He doesn't want to lead himself necessarily to glory, but we remember him because he was this great person. And we remember him through an individualistic lens, because we're in a modern individualistic era. But his glory and his historical identity is only possible because of France. It's only possible because of La Grande Armée. It's not possible on his own. But at the same time, he legitimately was the leader of that. He literally was the genius of that. He literally was the conductor of that. So I think that it's possible to form thymotic roles, and and from the perspective of being a one of Napoleon's generals, or just a soldier who one time got the approval of Napoleon. Um, I'm sounding like some big Napoleon nerd now. I know I'm just using him as an example, but there's also a sense of recognition of which, like, you need Napoleon to be the king in order for you to actually get his recognition and for that to be meaningful. It's not simply he has all the recognition and the rest of us are just poor and impoverished. He sort of acts as like a kind of depository of recognition, in the sense that if he was just like the rest of us and he said, "Well done, soldier," well, this would just be another stupid compliment. But the fact that he said that means something, So the hierarchies are not simply egotistical either. They're also, I would say, kind of corresponding, potentially, at least potentially. I know there's a lot of dangers with this, but at least potentially in a sort of co-elevational and positive and conducive manner to each other as well.
Yeah. Excellent. First off, as just a quick note, this conversation has helped me connect trust, recognition, and thymos, which is invaluable. So thank you for that, Owen. Second, I think capitalism has a tendency to replace what I call conditionalism with relativism. Like, life is conditional. You're conditioned by a certain nation and you need that nation to be a general. There are conditions that have to be met, but conditions are by definition particular and concrete. So as you move from the concrete in the body to the disembodied in the mental, the only way you can think about conditionalism is as relativism, your perspective, your mental orientation to the thing, not being conditioned by the thing. And so we don't think in terms of conditionalism anymore. We think in terms of relativism. Well, that means everyone's locked in a prison, etc. And then, people think that's scientifically verified with Einstein, and that's why Bergson and Whitehead were so critical of the implicit metaphysics of Einstein. They saw this would be the end of the world, basically. A way I would frame the problem that I will note, I take Alexander Bard when he talks about attentionalism to be talking about recognition, thymos, and how no matter how much money you have, you can't buy attention. You can't buy people wanting to hear what you have to say. And today, in today's world, like, rich people are doing everything in their power to buy thymos, basically. Buying attention, and they can't. So
this is the modern version of them buying credit for an artist building a great sculpture. That's
exactly right. Yeah. And yet, you could buy an artist to do it, but you can't buy people to find you interesting because it's fake. Because in your mind, you can't separate self-belief, self-delusion, and self-esteem, because you can never know for sure if they're there only because you paid them $100 to be there and tell you that you're interesting, as opposed to truly believe it. In fact, the presence of money can make it more tell to get a clear reading of why people are there, right? Like, one of the funny enough, one of the great advantages of the liminal web space is that if people are watching your videos, they're not there just because they're getting credit for a class. They literally are interested in what you have to say. Like, it gives oh, people actually are serious here. There's no doubt that anyone who are doing these whatever these videos are that we do on the liminal web, there's no doubt that anyone
symposiums.
Symposiums. There you go. There's no doubt that anyone is doing this for any other reason than because they think it's important. And that creates an entirely different atmosphere. Now, that comes with the tension of economic sustainability, of course, but that frames what I want to say, because that seems to be the tension. So a way I would think about the problem, I have a really, really big respect and adoration for an economic historian called Dietrich McCloskey. And he wrote a book called The Bourgeoisie Virtues, and he makes the argument that the great enrichment that started in really the 1800s, I mean, you can trace it to the 1600s in Holland, Britain, which basically is the Industrial Revolution. And she calls it the great enrichment because it was the beginning of the invention of air conditioning, of hammers, of clothing. Like, when you look around, what makes wealth is not money, but technology, which means creativity, innovation, and people make things. And before the 1800s, you were probably going to die at around 40. You wouldn't have air conditioning. Your life would be lost in manual labor. And, that would all kind of suck in some respects. Now, all of that was way better at addressing thymos, but it also meant there was no air conditioning. So the challenge to me, the way I think about it, and the main arguments he wants to make, is that what made the modern world, and it's actually a staggering argument, and I actually think in her 3-book trilogy, I'm convinced of it. Now, Maybe I'm not critical enough. I don't know. But I mean, the argument is a staggering. She argues that the reason why the world became so much richer was a change in rhetoric. She calls it rhetoric, which basically means values. Suddenly, being a businessman and a merchant became noble. You already mentioned it. It became like a good use of time. There was a nobility in work. Before that, you could never trust the banker. You could never trust the worker. And a gentleman was precisely someone who didn't work. And there was no like honor or recognition in business. And suddenly you could get recognition in business. And when that occurred, or let's put it, recognition in work, like as in a job, as in something that made money. Well, as soon as that happened,
or
suddenly
toil, to use the Hegelian term, toil.
Yes, that's right. And suddenly what ends up happening is people are like, oh, and there's dignity in work. And what that unintentionally did is unleash invention and technology, air conditioning, food. You and I can be on Zoom. We can listen to Mozart whenever we want and eat food. So she calls it the bourgeoisie virtues. But there's a problem. What we have to do today, there is no thematic address in the bourgeoisie virtues. That's my, I don't want to say critique of Dietrich Miklowski, but I think there is a bit of Fukuyama. I don't want to say she's big on Fukuyama. That doesn't sound right. But I do think there's a bit of thinking that the bourgeoisie virtues addresses thymos. I think the bourgeoisie virtues causes the great enrichment. She's convinced me of that. But what does it matter if you gain the world and you lose your soul, right? So there's this tension here. Now, she wants to argue, and this is probably true, that the bourgeoisie virtues actually are good for us in certain ways. Like it's good to figure out how to negotiate price or to be at work every day or to have a civilizing effect. There's an argument that there are ways that business are good for human beings. I agree with her. However, the ways that business are good for us are not necessarily thematically good for us. And the $1 million question, and the answer could be no. I'm not saying it's yes. This is what we're trying to figure out, if you ask me, in some respects. The $1 million question, is it possible to have bourgeoisie virtues and also address thymos? The answer so far is no. That's what we're trying to think. Is it possible or is it not? If the answer is no, then the only way to address thymos is an isolationist strategy, or to get rid of the modern capitalist order, basically, or to go back to a free market structure. But then if Marx is right about free markets naturally becoming monopolies, that may not work. I mean, that's a whole different conversation. But to me, a framing, and so I'll put it at you, if you agree with this framing, you don't have to, what you think of this framing, to think of the question as, is it possible to have bourgeoisie virtues and an address of thymos? Or must those always conflict with one another? I'm not saying you have the answer. I'm asking if that, because we have to agree on the right framing. Like if we don't agree on the right framing, then we can go everywhere. Is that a fair framing? And the answer might be no. I'm not saying it's yes, and I'm not saying we have to die creating a world that makes this happen, because it may be fundamentally contradictory, meaning it's not possible at its deepest root. But then again, it might be. Is that a fair framing? What do we think of this framing? This is me literally thinking live. So I don't, I'd be curious what you think.
No, I think the framing is good. The framing is, I think, the big question, and I think this is the big question. If you read like Fukuyama through, he's basically kind of asking, although he might come to a different conclusion to us, but he is asking this question. And is the capacity to make something with our thymotic psyches within these bourgeois virtues possible? That is the big question. My kind of answer, and I don't want to give a really explicit answer, because can we integrate elements of bourgeois virtue and elements of capitalism into a different order which does this? I think maybe. I'm not saying the answer has to be like we either have to completely accept a capitalist neoliberal society, or we have to address the thymos problem and go into some sort of completely revolutionary kind of level everything sort of moment. I think it's probably somewhere in between that. But one big problem, which is emerging. Well, I guess re-emerging actually, but just in a more dangerous framework, is as you were saying, this nobility of work, and I take back my Hegel comments because I didn't realize what everything you were going to say, and I think toil for Hegel is probably more general than what we're talking about. But so I take it back. I spoke too soon. But anyway, other than that, the making of nobility in this bourgeois way of work and so on, and then the unleashing of technological invention. And as I'm going to be teaching a Paul Virilio course soon, and he's all about critiquing kind of the mad scientist and the kind of techno science and the extreme science gone wrong. We're seeing, I think, the real vices and the real dangers of the unbound, unregulated, innovative spirit here. And there's biogenetics, AI, we could go on and on and on. And I think that the next century is going to be looking at those issues and going, I don't know. Like, we're going to have to think of a better way to sublimate our ambition and so forth. So that's my kind of skepticism there. But I do think the framework that you put is the big question. And I don't have an explicit answer. I think this requires a lot of thinking through, and it will be asked implicitly or explicitly over the next century, I think. But comment on that if you want. But I also just wanted to bring up, just to kind of jump back into Zarathustra, because we've kind of gone a little bit astray of Zarathustra. But sorry, Zarathustra. But anyway, I want good, because I think that and this is related to biogenetics and transhumanism, and innovation and so forth, and self-innovation, right? Self-innovation, or what Peter Sloterdijk would call anthropotechnics, a kind of techniques of ourselves as humans, which doesn't mean purely technological. It can mean practices and so on, and philosophy, and the building of cultures and building of morals. But so the tightrope analogy, and for people, I'm sure anyone who's read Zarathustra will know, the tightrope analogy is when Zarathustra goes to a town, he sees a tightrope walker. The walker is walking across. He falls halfway down. He dies, and everyone thinks this guy is an idiot, except Zarathustra, who thinks he's a kind of heroic character nearly, and he buries him in a forest. And the line on that is, let me try to remember. If I can't remember it perfectly, you can tell me. But it was man is a bridge. Man is not something. Man is a bridge between the animal and the superhuman, right? Man is not. What's the first part of that sentence? Man is not something. Man is a bridge. He says, he kind of negates something and says, man is a bridge. Man is not a goal. Man is a bridge. That's it. Man is not a goal. Man is a bridge. And this is an important statement because take genetics, like there's a sense in which if we think, if we just like manipulate human genes to make someone perfect, we're kind of making man the goal. He's no longer a bridge, then he's a goal. So you see, I think, a misunderstanding of Nietzsche when people try claim Nietzsche for a kind of vulgar transhumanist project. I would like to claim Nietzsche, and I'm not saying claim Nietzsche and put him in a specific category that I have designated for myself or anything, but like, or for us or for anyone, but I would like to, challenge the designation of Nietzsche as this sort of transhumanist thinker in the modern sense, which we are kind of smothered in today. So what do you think about that?
I agree. I 100% agree. I think that basically, if we think of man as a bridge, then I mean, this question of, can you have a bourgeoisie virtue? Because I'm convinced that bourgeoisie virtues created the modern world in terms of riches. But I'm also convinced of the Paul Virilio, the AI, the societies of captured Deleuze, et cetera, so forth. And I'm convinced that bourgeoisie virtues do not address with thymos. So the question is, which all of belonging again to address is kind of obsessed with, because you have to get into the nitty freaking gritty of what the classroom looks like, the economy looks like, blah, blah, blah. To me, basically, that question of bourgeoisie virtues plus thymos address is our current bridge question. Can we cross that bridge? And I cannot help but see a lot of bioengineering as actually avoiding that. as actually how do we create humans that just have thymos addressed? Okay, well that's kind of cheating, really. That's like a cheat code. You're not overcoming anything if you can just program people as God. If you can just, you're not a God if you're born a God. You have to become a God. And the problem with transhumanism is we're trying to birth gods, not become gods per se. And Nietzsche would find that disgusting because that's not for man to reach the next state per se. That's for some other being we may misdiagnose as man to become the next state. Like, and the issue also too with, say, transhumanists living forever, all those different things. The reason why it's different from what Nietzsche is talking about is because you don't have to face your worst fears to have your genes edited. You don't have to face that conversation you don't want to have in order to have like a heart that's like super capable or a super brain, right? In fact, it could be the worst of all possible things because you might have a brain that helps you avoid or rationalize. Like if we get let me tell you, if we get the super brain, you know what we're going to use it for? To rationalize not doing anything. And we'll never have to do anything because
to rationalize being last men. That's what he's
Yes,
doing.
that's what we're going to do. That's all we're going to do. Yeah. Because truth isn't rational. The truth isn't the rational. We determine the truth according to which we rationalize. And the very act of getting that super brain is going to then rationalize the culture in which we use that super brain to feel better. And so that's all we're going to do. And then it will be like Kierkegaard's Despair, where he says the man in despair doesn't know he's in despair. That will be the world where we think we're gods precisely when we're in hell. But we won't have the capacity. We'll be so smart, but not smart enough to realize that we're in hell, because that will be locked out by the very act of the transhumanistic movement. I prefer what one of the essays in the Abyssal Arrows calls essay on hyperhumanism, where it's a question of how do we, and it's Ivan Illich as well, how do we use technology to extend humanity, not replace humanity? That is the $1 million question. That could look like life extension or various biogenetic technologies, but the telos and reason for using them would be radically different. And there is also the glaring question of are there some technologies you that inherently always replace humanity in their use? Like there's no way to use
artificial wombs.
Well, they didn't. I think they just did the first test of those like yesterday or something. Actually, that was successful. Ain't that something? I was reading on that, so we'll see. But no, that's a great example. And it is. Look, it's very telling in Fukuyama's work on bioengineering, where basically he's saying we need to return to first principles. And you just want to go, you do know that the whole liberal order that you're defending, you brought this up, where it's like, that was to escape all the religious wars, dude. Like, it was like the whole problem.
The whole foundation of liberalism is being gotten rid of then. Yeah.
Yes. But then that would be the question of, basically to me, that's another way of stating bourgeoisie virtues with thymotic address somehow. How do you do that? I think so. The next part would be, so man is a bridge in that sense. And also there's something where Nietzsche is saying that Michelle said this yesterday, like man needs to need. Like we need to be becoming something or we die. If we are a bridge, then we always have to have a horizon of becoming. And if we cease to have that, we become problematic. And also that's very interesting, the very fact that we kind of assume Zarathustra is an overman, and in a way he is, but there's another sense in which it's kind of suggested he's not yet, right? Like he's still in the becoming, and sometimes it seems like the overman is a state. It's always a state, and it's not like like waiting for Godot thing, but there's always more of an overman you could become. Even if you are an overman, you can always do better, always become more. And I think that's suggested. So it's, even if you are the overman, it's almost better to think of yourself as a human who's a bridge. Precisely because the moment you think of yourself as one, you stop. Almost like Peter walking on the water. He's great till he looks down and then he sinks, right? Like an overman almost by definition never thinks of themselves as an overman, because the moment they do, they're done. So there's there's this kind of weird move going on. And how do you create a society where that's possible for people to become overmen without falling into the temptation of identifying themselves as such and thus losing it? So those are some thoughts, and now I'm extremely tempted, and it's somehow been 2 hours and 30 minutes because you're so magical, Owen. I'll tell you what. But I also at this point wonder, like the big thing I'll talk about is replacing certification with portfolio models. to make thymos possible in bourgeoisie virtues. Like right now, like you get qualified or you get recognition based on what? Your resume, right? Like, well, that's stagnant, that's kind of dead, and that's in the past. Or you graduated from this university. One of the things I like about YouTube is it kind of feels like a portfolio, right? It's like, oh, do you know philosophy? Well, look at these. I don't have a certificate, but I got a portfolio, dang it. And I wonder if, I can't help but ask you your thoughts on this. I wonder if part of the question is actually replacing the resume with the portfolio. like instead of having these resumes, which, hey, maybe maybe you learn how to talk philosophy at college, right? But the proof is in the portfolio, just like the proof of the soldier is on the battlefield, or it's like on the field. And I'm wondering if what society needs, basically, I would replace the classroom, like test taking, with portfolio building. I would create fields of battle, per se, where people can prove themselves. Because right now, one of the things that sucks is it feels like, oh, I'm just assumed not to know philosophy as well as this guy from Princeton because he has a degree. But every time he talks, he has nothing interesting to say. But forever forth, because he graduated when he was 24 from Princeton, he is the expert on philosophy and everyone else isn't, right? There's something about that problem where the portfolio is more alive. And it's like, oh, you're better at philosophy. Let me watch your life. You haven't made a video in 2 years. What's going on, man? It's dead, right? Like, there's so many, like, let me tell you this. There's so many, like, people who graduate from elite universities who stop reading. They just completely stop reading. Yeah. And so you just assume they're still doing philosophy. They don't even know who Slyerdock is. They don't know who Ivan is. They don't know. And I'm not trying to be arrogant. I'm just saying the problem with the resume is it's stagnant. It doesn't reflect the current state. And I wonder if, because the portfolio also feels communal, because a resume seems like a degree from Princeton seems to have value even if there isn't a community. I graduated from Princeton, right? But if it's a portfolio, you require the community for that recognition, right? And also you're like, well, I know the meaning of I'll stop. I'm sorry, but like a Princeton degree, you yourself actually may not know the meaning of it. Because you're like, I took these classes. What does it actually mean? So there's not a clear distinction between self-belief and self-delusion and self-esteem. But in a portfolio, it's like, yeah, look at this. This is an actual book. You people can read it. And I wonder if the portfolio, because I do think structures of certification are a big part of the problem. And that if you're going to have bourgeoisie virtues plus thymos, it's going to need something like the replacement of the certificate, which, like you said, can mean different things to different people, but let's just take it like the degree and the resume and all that. The replacement of that with the portfolio. And that seems to be, or the field, that seems to be maybe part of the conversation. Not that it is. I'd be curious your response to that.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. Because you're sort of replacing a very static, credential, identity, piece of status, or a position of status, with an ongoing pursuit.
Becoming,
yeah,
an ongoing becoming, yeah,
and like that's more, it's less referring constantly to this thing. It's a bit like the guy who, like, did something great when he was like 18 and now he's like 45 and he's telling his friends about it the whole time. And he won't stop talking about it. It's like he's not showing, he's just referring to this one thing, so there's a problem with that. I suppose there's also a problem of in order to build a portfolio, there's entry into the field, there's entry into the practice, which from a YouTube philosophy perspective, it's quite easy because all you got to really do is build up the confidence to do it and read a lot. And like that, it's not easy to do it. It's not, there's not a gatekeeping of access.
Yes.
But you could have other things where you require a certain amount of resources, or you require certain permission from the council to do. I don't know. I can't think of something here, but there's examples where you need permission from an authority, you need a certain amount of resources. And then therefore it's like you can never actually get into the position of building a portfolio, because you're kind of constantly on the outside. So like the portfolio model might be flawed in that sense, but not.
Sure.
But when there is access, I think that it's probably much better than the credential sense. Yeah.
I mean, there's always a risk of any decentralization being centralized. The question becomes, I guess, what increases the likelihood that doesn't occur? Like, it's always probability, right? And an advantage of the portfolio is if, the guy's like, well, you can't put up your videos here. Well, you can always put it up somewhere else, like, and people can see it. Like, the value is in the open. There's no question of the value. Whereas if you have a skill in investment banking, you do require like working at the investment bank to show people the value of that skill. So it's very like invisible and hidden that way. A portfolio model, especially in the humanities, I mean, that problem, you're going to need a car to show your engineering share. I understand that. But how do we reduce as much invisibility as possible? Like, how do you increase as much visibility as possible? Because visibility tends to favor decentralization and not having those problems, even though those problems are always lurking. And the portfolio, especially in the humanities, seems to be part of the equation. And it is interesting because, like, with artists, like we talked, the great Jorge Rivera, the guy, you've got works that they're doing in their 40s, or like their whole life. It's not just the 20 high school football game. It's their entire life that they can describe. And it feels much more alive and much more like becoming. And it's like, oh, this person is still engaged in that. So increasing visibility. But I think all of that as just a general marker to close. And I this has been really great. I really like talking to you. Like, something about, and anything else you want to talk about, I didn't mean to close. But something about increased visibility, something about portfolio over resume, something about thymos and bourgeoisie virtues. Those all seem to be part of the question of how to address the current moment without an isolationist strategy. Because I think it's clear isolationist strategies do address the problem, but they're not addressing the possibility of bourgeoisie virtues with thymos. And that's where we get into things like portfolio over certification, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The humanities portfolio is an interesting idea because you would normally associate a portfolio with something more technical, like, graphic design. You have like a portfolio of things that you've written or made or whatever, or if you're an architect, you have a portfolio of the projects you've worked on. But it's funny, the humanities portfolio is good because you don't need a lot of resources, and you don't need a certain like legal or conventional access to something. You can kind of just jump in, and it's really just about showing, like, when there's space to jump in, showing is possible. But so yeah, we can finish up in a minute. But I suppose just to wrap up on the bourgeois thymos question, I think that actually is like possibly one of the biggest, just to reaffirm that, possibly one of the biggest questions at the moment, because we're at a deadlock with it as a society. We're experiencing the excesses of the sort of innovative bourgeois sublimation of authority, nobility, and so forth with these technological problems, AI and biogenetics and so forth. We're experiencing mass mental health issues. And I think that, just to reiterate Peter Sloterdijk again, we have psychology that's thought very long and hard about eros, but it's not thought about thymos yet. And I think that really has to happen. And I think that the problem with that is that, from a very orthodox psychoanalytical perspective, they see issues which we would associate as thymos, or as Hegel, or as Plato, or whoever. They would see those as sort of real, but sort of secondary to the libidinal complex. It's like they're kind of the consequences of the libidinal complexes. And I think that's increasingly hard to argue. I'm looking at things and I'm going, like, I understand how they relate to each other. I understand that if you have extreme thymotic problems, you're probably going to have extreme erotic problems. And if you have extreme erotic problems, you're probably going to maybe have, but like but one is not like in front and the other is just a consequence of the other. That's a dogma which we need to leap over. We have to walk over it on the tightrope, so yeah. So I'll wrap it up there, but if you have any closing comments, go ahead.
I would just one say that I've really enjoyed this, and I think this is getting at the heart of the issue, which to me, it's very difficult to get to the heart of the issue. So thank you, sir. I think you put it very well to say we have assumed that Eros would address Thymos. No. Eros is part, you know this. You mentioned the tripart soul of the classical conception. Like there are if you talk about something like, Bard talks about mythos, eros, and logos. Well, we could talk about eros, logos, and thymos. You can't replace any of those. You have to address all three of those to have a successful society. If you grant me that, you have to do all three. None of them can replace the other. Well, that makes everything really hard, because if you could just do one and address the others, well, great. Let's just get really good at eros. It doesn't. No. Well, let's get really good at logos. No, that's the modern world, totalitarianism and all that. Well, let's get really good at thymos. Well, that could be the pre-modern world. There was problems with that. The name of the game is it's a situation. The way I'll talk about it with Leibniz and Hegel is that we're dealing with a situation of moving parts. Like it's a whole situation. Like Leibniz kind of wanted to replace, and Anthony will talk about this, metaphysics with metageometry. It's always geometrical. Like you're always talking about a situation that you have to coordinate to make work. Society is not like a math problem, 2 + 2 = 4. It's more like the coordination of a situation that if it is not properly coordinated is a disaster. And so what you have to have is the coordination of eros, I'm saying eros, thymos, and logos. I think if we're following Hegel for just a moment, I think we could say, well, the bourgeoisie virtues were a mistake and we shouldn't have done that. Well, there's air conditioning, there's internet, there's all these things. I think it almost doesn't matter. Like by what standard would you say it's a mistake? It happened and here we are. So the more difficult thing to think, which I think we should think, because you could come up with a million reasons for why we should just get rid of the bourgeoisie virtues, and they probably are all true. But the question is it possible, as Hegel will say, to negate sublate the bourgeois without the thymos into a bourgeois with the thymos? This to me is, they talk about the hard problem of consciousness. I will call this the hard problem of modern society. And that to me is where then it's kind of a base. The jury's still out. I'm not saying the answer is yes. I'm saying at least we can, with that, know what we're judging, know what we need to try to consider, and that will go about that different work and thinking it
just as a last note, would you say that this question is intrinsic to the Übermensch project? Is it intrinsic?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think so too.
100%.
Okay.